All right, everyone, we're going to commence with our second session, How Artificial Intelligence is Transforming the Life Science and Pharma Industry. Please take your seats while we welcome to the stage Katie Aiello, Senior Director of AI and ML Engineering at GSK, Joydeep Ganguly, Senior Vice President of Corporate Operations, Chief Sustainability Officer at Gilead Sciences, Mary Rosenman, CFO and CBO at Incitro. Joining us by Zoom, Vibhor Gupta, Director and Founder of Pangea Data, and our moderator, Sam Hawgood, UCSF Chancellor and BAC Board Member. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here to moderate this panel this morning. I think it's obviously a very timely and very exciting topic, and I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with our panelists and with Vibhor, who is on Zoom with us. I'm not sure from what country, possibly London, but from somewhere remote. So I'm Sam Hawgood. I'm the Chancellor of the University of California, San Francisco, one of the 10 campuses of the University of California. Why this is of particular interest to us as a university is, unlike most universities, we are not a comprehensive university, but we focus just on the life sciences and on the delivery of healthcare. So this panel is absolutely in our sweet spot, and we have been doing a lot of work over the last year on how to integrate AI into our three primary missions. That is discovery science. We are one of the largest academic biomedical research institutions in the country. Clinical care, we operate a large health system, and then education, training the next generation of life scientists and physicians and other healthcare providers. So very timely, very exciting for us. I'm going to just spend 2 minutes with a little bit of context, and then we'll jump in, have a great discussion. We're going to try to make this as conversational as we can, and I hope we'll be able to find time at the very end for any questions that any of you have, so please be thinking about it as you go along. I know we have a very eclectic audience here, not such a technical audience, so we're going to try to helicopter up a little bit and talk about some of the big themes in this area of AI and the intersection with life sciences. So obviously scientific discovery occurs over many centuries, and it's built on what has come before, but it tends not to be a linear process. It tends to come in certain epochal jumps where, usually associated with a breakthrough in technology, there's an explosion of science and then a period of adaptation and incremental change before the next big explosion. Just to give you a few examples of that, think of the discovery of the printing press in the 1400s and what that did to the world. The invention of the telescope and microscope in the early 1600s, the steam engine in the 1700s, electricity and the telephone in the 1800s, and flight in the 1900s, to name just a few breakthroughs in technology that allowed scientific discovery and human progress to move forward in an unprecedented acceleration. In our own lifetime, we have seen computers introduced, recombinant DNA technologies, the internet, GPS, the smartphone, the Genome Project, CRISPR gene editing, and recoding of human cells for therapies, again, just to name a few. What's impressive in our lifetime is that the period of time available for adaptation to the new technologies is becoming shorter and shorter, and it feels like we are in an exponential age of change, where it's very hard to sort of grab a technology and understand it before the next breakthrough comes. And we're going to now talk about what is the latest breakthrough in technology. A new generation of artificial intelligence has become widely available. Literally, although it's been worked on for many decades, the widespread applications have become available literally in the last 1 or 2 years. Some have said that this breakthrough, by augmenting and amplifying human intelligence, will be more transformational to our societies than any of the prior technological advances. It's obviously very early days. So what we're not going to do today is focus on the hype or the doom. We're going to try to show you through a number of use cases in life sciences and pharma, how this is actually here in our now, right now. The tools of artificial intelligence and machine learning are making a huge difference, not just in the outcomes of the work, but how the work itself is approached and thought about. So what I'm going to do is move with our panel from very early discovery science through the kind of operations and manufacturing of biotech and pharma, and then we'll migrate into the clinical space and patient-facing areas where AI is having an effect. So to begin, I would like to, as I ask each of our panelists a question, I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves in 1 or 2 sentences about why they're on the stage with me today. And I'll start with the beginning of the therapeutic pipeline. That is a few questions on fundamental discovery science and how AI is changing not just what we can do, but how we do it. So I'd like to start with Mary, ask you to say a few words about yourself, and then I'll pose you a question.
Super. Thanks so much, Sam, and thank you so much to the Bay Area Council also for having me here today. So I am Mary Rosenman. I'm the CFO and CBO of a company called InCitro. By background, I'm actually an organic chemist, chemical biologist, so PhD in that area, then was a junior partner at McKinsey & Company in New York, focused on the intersection of pharma and corporate finance, and for a number of years was a venture capital and private equity investor here in the Bay Area, before discovering about a decade ago that what I really loved to do was roll up my sleeves and build companies. I've been with InCitro for 4.5 years, and what we are doing at InCitro is we are building a truly ground-up, machine learning-enabled drug discovery and development company that uses machine learning on extremely high-quality, vast collections of data, so data at scale, to uncover novel genetic drivers of disease, novel data-driven biomarkers for the selection of patients for the prosecution of those novel genetic targets, and also for the discovery and development of novel therapeutics.
Great. So InCitro, as Mary said, really believes in this confluence of new data analytic tools, including artificial intelligence and large data sets to circumvent some of the traditional experimental models to get to drug targets. What gave you the confidence that the field had matured enough to take this bold step of building a company around that idea?
Yeah, so we really are at an incredible moment in time. And I would say that, I'm the prescient one, but that's really not the case. InCitro was founded by founder and CEO Daphne Koller, who is a true machine learning pioneer, was actually the first machine learning hire into Stanford's computer science department many, many years ago, literally wrote the book on probabilistic graphical models, which is a technology that underpins a lot of the machine learning and generative AI technology that we all benefit from today. And after that, really built a career at the intersection, not only of fundamental, high quality mathematical machine learning, but also biologic data, going back to the very, very early days of that field where people started to ask, can we apply computer vision to radiographic data from a brain scan or from mammogram data and draw conclusions in a better way by using computer vision? People have been thinking about the potential of using these technologies, Daphne Koller at the center of a lot of that work, for many, many years. So why is this moment in time so different? Because I think, as Sam said, this really is different. We really are at an exponential period. But I think much like with any exponential curve, we're actually at the part of it that doesn't yet go straight up. You can look around you and you can read the papers that are coming out and you can see that things are changing, but they're not changing as drastically and radically as I think they will be very, very soon as the exponential continues to move. So what's really driving that change, I think, are 3 things. The first is the availability of extremely high quality data, driven by our ability to generate that data in fit for purpose model systems of disease in our lab and generate data on those systems in a whole slew of ways.
Mary, could you just say a little bit more about the term fit for purpose? I'm not sure everyone in
Oh,
the
sorry.
room
Yes,
understands.
thank you. And please,
But I think it's such an important concept.
So really, fit for purpose data means you're not looking at just whatever data is available. You're looking at objectively, rigorously, thoughtfully collected data, and you're using that. So you're saying, I have a cell, the cell model is disease. I'm going to take a bunch of pictures of that cell. I'm going to look at RNA expression levels in that cell. I'm going to look at the genetics in that cell. And I'm going to collect that data, and I'm going to do everything to that cell in a way that's very tightly controlled, and I'm going to collect all of that data too. That's called metadata. And I'm going to put all of those pieces together, and I'm going to then use that data, that fit for purpose data that was generated in a very structured and rigorous and controlled way, to build machine learning models that I can use to make predictions. And the reason that's so important is that machine learning is incredibly good at picking up on signal, but it's also incredibly good at picking up on artifact. And so if your data is not fit for purpose, if you have significant variability in the workflow, in the cellular workflow, for example, that leads to the generation of that data, that variability is what the model will learn. Much like in the early days where I gave the example of the mammogram data, what those original models learned were the brands of the scanners, because the scanners were different. So you need to take all of the variability out of the equation, and you need to generate truly fit for purpose, high quality data to do the work that we're trying to do.
That's great.
So data is the first piece. The second piece are massive advancements in algorithms that many, many smart people have been working on for a long time. And now we're just at a point in a community that's in the community that's incredibly exciting. And the third critical piece is the vast availability of high quality compute. So the availability of GPUs from a large number of providers, that level of compute is critically important to do, especially the generative AI and large language model work that underpins a lot of the advancements here.
Great, thank you. Before turning to Katie to pick up on that theme, I'll just say one of the challenges as an academic university with a tradition of individual faculty-driven labs, this issue of fit-for-purpose data is really important, because while we're collecting massive amounts of data, it's not necessarily structured in a way that can feed into the algorithm. So I think it's going to drive change in the way academic biomedical research is done, as well as companies that are very focused.
I'll add one comment on that. We took the decision at the time when In-Sitro was formed back in 2018 not to rely on data from outside of the company. And we really built the company bottom up as an automation company. We have about 100,000 square feet of automation robotic space just down the road in South San Francisco. That was a major investment that we made as a company. And we generate fit for purpose in cellular systems. The other piece of the company that's come online in the past 3 years has really been around clinical data. Because in the same period of time, what we recognized was there was actually a tremendous amount of control in the data that's objectively collected from patients. And I don't mean physician notes. I mean histopathology data. I mean radiographic data from MRI. I mean transcriptomic and genetic data from real patients, which we've also accessed at a massive scale that's been hugely enabling to our work, largely because we're able to put the pieces together, learning from the cells, learning from the people, and building greater confidence in the predictions that we're making at In-Sitro.
Katie, could you just briefly introduce yourself, and then I'll
Sure.
ask you to pick up on some of these themes.
Yes, my name is Katie Aiello, thrilled to be here. I'm a Senior Director of Machine Learning Engineering at GSK here in South San Francisco. And at GSK, we have an organization of over 150 machine learning engineers and researchers embedded in a global biopharma company. And our remit is to bring AI to bear across the entire R&D pipeline. So all the way from early target identification and discovery biology, as we were discussing, through to patient stratification, clinical decision support, clinical trials, and beyond.
Great. So unlike a startup, In-Sitro, GlaxoSmithKline has been around for centuries.
Yeah.
and is a huge international pharma. So how is AI disrupting traditional pharma, and what does that feel like within the company, the culture change? As you know, we have a great collaboration in this space with GlaxoSmithKline, so I've seen it a little bit from the inside, but I'd love to hear you about how this is disrupting big pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really exciting time in big pharma, and we're seeing as Mary said, there's sort of the awareness that this tide is coming and things are starting to change, but we're really just starting to see those early wins and that signal that I think is really getting people who maybe don't have a formal background or didn't come in to the machine learning space to really buy into it and see the potential for where this can go. And so again, it's still early days, and getting that sort of to snowball culturally within such a large institution is of course challenging, but I think it's really exciting to see how that's beginning to change. And I think one of the really exciting reasons why big pharma turns out to be a great place to do this is because we do have access to the abilities to do this data generation, the scientific expertise in the disease areas to understand what those translational models that can bridge from early discovery through to the clinical space are. And I think going back to that commentary around fit for purpose comes up a lot in our discussion and the culture change that we see for this in pharma, because pharma companies have been developing fit for purpose at the time data to support target progression for as long as we've been doing drug development. But now our definition of fit for purpose, when that purpose is developing therapeutics in an environment supported by machine learning, changes. The value of an individual piece of information about a target or about a disease suddenly shifts because we can think about ways of reusing data. The type of information, the type of signal that's useful for a model might be different from a disease biologist if they're looking at that in sort of the current platforms and technologies that they would use historically. And so I think it's really this confluence of factors where we're starting to see the early signal of machine learning. We're getting a lot more literacy and awareness across the entire workforce about what that can look like. And they see the capabilities in the technological advances of scientific platforms, of automation biology, of bringing the clinical components of this to bear. So I think that's a lot of what it's been like so far. And as Mary said, I think we're just getting to the exciting part.
You know, a lot of the press and to some extent hype that's certainly been here in the Bay Area in the last 11 months has been around these large language models and companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Inflection and others. Where do the assumptions that the fundamental AI tech companies, how well do they translate into biomedicine, and does there need to be a translator of some sort to make that work?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of the challenge. I think when we look around, especially right here in the Bay Area, of some of these success stories where we've already seen machine learning be so transformative, we look to tech. And it's not necessarily just the models and the algorithms that are so transformative for the Netflix and Google and Amazon tech companies. It's that they're able to marry the technology, the data generation, the metadata capture, retrain models, annotate new data points in real time, and learn how model predictions do or do not perform in the real world. That's a lot easier to do. I would argue it's easier to do in real time in tech when the time scales of that feedback sync up. In biology, that's really challenging because we're more limited in the assays that we can perform. The time scales of biological experiments compared to being able to train a new model are different. And so I think really putting our heads together across entire companies and workforce about how we can take the learnings from these success stories in other industries where we've been able to bridge software engineering and data engineering and automation and machine learning to really start to see this transformative step change effect is exactly what we're aiming to do now in the biotech and pharmaceutical space.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to Joydeep. Introduce yourself, a couple of sentences, and then I'll pose a question.
Sure, so my name is Joydeep Ganguly. I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Gilead Sciences. For those folks that don't know, Gilead's a biotech company, biopharma company, specializes in virology, oncology, and inflammation. I am an electrical engineer by education. I actually did my undergraduate in mathematics. I did it at a time where AI used to be the easy course where you got an A because it was actually a simple course. Right now, at the time, machine learning, et cetera. And now it's become a very, very ubiquitously, almost like a buzzword right now in the industry. I spent a lot of time at Biogen prior to my time at Gilead, actually in a group called Process Analytical Technology, which focused on using machine learning, AI in its rudimentary form in the early 2000s to apply to large-scale manufacturing processes as we scale from very small labs to large reactors. I also serve as the company's chief sustainability officer, so I'm super interested in the potential of AI to actually disrupt the overall ESG equation as most companies move from pledges to action over the next few years. Delighted to be here.
Great. So I'd like to now move us from basic discoveries. So our first two panelists produce what they think is going to be a successful drug and then hand it off to someone like Joydeep to manufacture it at scale so that it can become, in fact, clinically relevant. So how is AI disrupting the operations of a pharma company? Not the discovery side, but the manufacturing and getting it to market side.
Yeah, I have 3 points on that, but before I get into that, I think I'm very inspired by the first two speakers. Now, I'll just give you a very helicopter comment.
Sure.
If you take a look at the P&L statements, and I know you're CFO, so it's very familiar, the average biopharma company, when you read GSK or Gilead, we only spend 10 to maybe 20% on research, right? Most of the costs, people like me spend. It's the operations, it's the manufacturing plants, because eventually people don't want just promise, they actually want medicines that go into clinics and cure people and help people. The unbridled waste right now within the overall ecosystem has been one that's built up over decades because we are a very compliant, regulated industry that uses quality and quality assurance tenets often to drive large investments in the supply chain, be it in how many plants you have, be it in terms of quality systems. And that often ends up being in a very perverse equation where my budget tends to exceed the budget of our chief research officer. So the biggest way that AI, I believe, can disrupt this entire ecosystem is flip the equation where we need to be spending more time in research, more money on discovery. That's how you affect humanity in the long run. And the overall fundamental operations engine that drives and maintains the biopharma industry is done at a more efficient frontier. So in that end, there are just three things that I sort of look at right now. And I've tried to oversimplify it for my team that has a bunch of AI practitioners that have a lot of machine learning specialists. It is around impact for me. So we are very motivated by the ability of these tools in its current maturation state to completely upend the equation as it comes to predictive modeling, quality assurance, everything that we today do with a very heavy paper industry, relying on testing quality into the product, and to try and develop models where you can actually predict the outcome of a manufacturing batch. An average manufacturing batch for an antibody is $6 million. So if you lose it, you've lost $6 million. And that's because we tend to make the batch, and then at the end of it, after 90 days, test the batch to see whether it meets parameters. That is the most archaic way of releasing a batch to the market, and then absorb the cost, and eventually all that costs get passed on to the healthcare system. So there's an element around quality assurance and predictive modeling. There's a huge element also around trying to finally give us a place where we can drive a far better way of scaling up and tech transferring this. Right now, the worst news for me is when the researchers succeed, because now I have to make it. And I'm like, how do I now deliver it? Because everyone's like, oh, now the easy part, hard part's done. Now we just supply to 43 markets, file it in 80 countries, make it available, and do it at a low cost. Now that is overwhelmingly, that is like stuff nightmares are made of, right? And you can't build the infrastructure because if the molecule fails, which it often does, you end up with overbuilding the infrastructure. So what AI and machine learning can do is accelerate, I think, not just collaborative partnerships, but actually lower the time it takes from a drug being successful in the lab to getting it into a patient, right? 6-month tech transfers, 9-month tech transfers should be a thing of the past. And by using this kind of natural language processing, by using machine learning, you can accelerate this. And I won't spend too much time because I want to give the fourth speaker's got some very interesting points as well. ESG, it's the late, I mean, if there's another buzzword that is competing with AI right now, it's ESG. Everyone's got an ESG, everyone's got a...
Say what ESG is.
ESG is environmental social governance, and it's a framework that a lot of the investors now are demanding of not just life sciences companies, but large companies then we can't just keep focusing on our own profitability, and we have a greater good, a greater obligation towards the planet, our people, our processes. The sustainability officer sort of title is an homage to the fact that I look after the environmental things, and whereas we put people and planet over profits. And that requires us to achieve our operations at things like net zero and carbon neutral. It's tough because when you have a life sciences, and the only issue with the life sciences industry is because we have a patient at the end of the supply chain, that dominates every piece of thinking. No one's worried about greenhouse gases when you have to supply drugs to patients who are in need of that. I actually see AI and machine learning with all its sensors, with all its ability to do predictive management, ability to actually work through the ESG framework as a way where finally companies can move from where they are today, which is pledge heavy. Everyone's got a pledge, to actually moving towards net zero faster, because you're able to do better utilization of your assets, you're able to actually predict greenhouse gas sort of footprints, and you actually get to the point where you're able to do well by doing good. And I think, I hopefully this is not an irreverent comment, but as an industry, that's not something you associate with biopharma all the time, right? And I think over time, this is where I think AI machine learning can really reduce the waste, get us to where we can actually stop making trade-offs between frameworks like ESG and profitability. And hopefully 10 years from now, when if I'm back in this panel, the budget equation's flipped where we actually have more capacity to do cool research because operations is actually far more efficient, and we don't benchmark Intel and Apple as good operations sort of outfits, and the life sciences industry is viewed as a paragon of efficiency.
Great, well, thank you. Vibhor, I'd like you to join the discussion. Could you introduce yourself, and then I'll ask you to help us take this further down the pipeline towards patients.
Well, thank you, Chancellor Hawgood, and a very good afternoon to everyone over there. My name is Dr. Vibhor Gupta. I'm calling today from our headquarters in London, in the UK. My background is in oncology, and I have been working in medicine and computing for about 22 years, both in academia, through my collaborators at Imperial College in London, and also in the industry, through our work predominantly with pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers. So I believe I come from the other end of the spectrum on the panel of how to realize the benefits of technology, and I've seen a fair few in the last 2 decades in the context of treating patients and delivering effective care. So happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Vibhor. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how AI will directly affect patients, how conceptually at least it could perhaps improve the accuracy of diagnoses, how it could potentially even reduce the cost of treatments and better predict resource utilization, finding patients for clinical trials, any number of examples that you're an expert in.
Yes, absolutely. So you see, from a clinical standpoint, every time we, one of the biggest focus areas for us is how do we connect the patient to the right therapy? Essentially, that we have to do, and how to do that effectively. And as you can appreciate, it impacts not just us in the clinic, but most importantly, of course, it has a direct impact on patients. It has an impact on pharmaceutical companies who, as you heard, are spending a lot of money and time in getting those therapies out to the market. And it certainly impacts the payers who are paying for it. So for us, being able to find ways in which we can connect the patient to the right therapy are critical. So for example, more recently, our focus has been, how do you solve this big challenge of finding undiagnosed patients? Which in medicine is a huge problem. I mean, we have 7,000 hard to diagnose conditions that we know about, where about 80 to 90% of the patient population is undiagnosed. And you would be astounded to hear that, from a common man perspective, because what that means is that there are a very large proportion of patients, to put it in context of millions of patients, who are there who should be treated, but either are not aware that they should be treated, or their clinicians are not aware that they exist in the system, and therefore they're not being brought in for the right clinical care pathway. So that, of course, has a direct impact on patient outcomes, which only get worse in the clinic. And in the provider side, it has a direct outcome on health burden. It leads to increased costs. It leads to an impact on resource planning, as you can appreciate. And for pharmaceutical companies, it's a huge problem because, as Chancellor Hawgood just alluded to, it means less patients for their clinical trials. But of course, more importantly, less patients who are benefiting from the therapies that they have on the market. So we wanted to solve this problem. And we, of course, had two approaches in mind. One was, well, how would you do this if without technology, which was just keep doing what you're doing. But as I'm sure you've heard from several clinicians who you might have interacted with, time is very limited. At best, you probably could have 10 minutes with a patient, because more than 70% of our time is going in capturing information for a patient or simply reviewing it. So then the second option was, well, if you're already spending such a large proportion of your time capturing this information and reviewing it, and spending a lot of money, millions of dollars in building infrastructure for supporting all of this information capture, then could you use technology to perhaps lessen your workload and such that you could find more of these patients without you having to do the grunt work? And that's really where we are coming from. We have raised more than $300 million through our partners in academic research funding. Most recently, this included a large grant for about $110 million to work on large language models and apply them to understand and solve this very problem of finding undiagnosed patients. And the early insights, which we have published in peer-reviewed publications, are quite promising because they show, for example, in the context of oncology, which is my domain, we have patients with cachexia, which is a form of muscle loss in cancer patients, is terribly underdiagnosed in 80% of the patients and leads to about 50% casualties. The literature would say 20%, but in surgery, we see almost 50%. It's a real problem. And when we started with this clinical objective to find more of these patients, by using artificial intelligence combined with medical guidelines that we would normally use in the clinic, rather than looking for any symptoms and things like that, we were truly able to mimic through computational approaches what we do as humans. Thereby, I'm not going to say we passed the Turing test, to use that computational benchmark, but we were getting pretty close to it, proving that we were actually able to find more patients. In this particular study, we were finding as many as 6 times more patients, which is about 200,000 patients annually, compared to what we would have found if we were using any other sort of previously available approaches. And what we showed through that is that in these patients, we were able to halve the cost of treatment from £10,000 to £5,000, which in the context of these 200,000 patients, as you might imagine, is about £1 billion in savings annually, just for one condition. Now we've done similar work in COPD, where we are, from a health economic standpoint, you're looking at a $200 billion saving annually, just in the US. So that's one example. I hope you can see where this is going. Of course, the pharmaceutical companies who are sponsoring a lot of this work are highly motivated for the reasons I described earlier. And so are healthcare providers and clinicians, because it allows them the opportunity to apply AI and be able to explain its results with a clinical rationale rather than based on a mathematical rationale, which is very important to us, and be able to do so, we haven't touched upon it, in a privacy-preserving manner, because for us, patient data is sacrosanct, maintaining its privacy is very important, and be able to deploy AI without having to transact data or transfer data was very important to us. So being able to achieve that explainability, privacy preservation, and finally, that third aspect of a business model in collaboration with partners such that we're self-sustaining is really motivating us to continue this work.
Great, thank you. so much. What I thought I would turn to now is just some open questions for all the panel, and please join in and have a conversation. We're at a forum here today that's all about economic development. So how do you think AI is changing the workforce needs in the life sciences? What do you think the next generation, looking at 10 years from now, where do places like universities need to be thinking about changing who we train and how we train? And also an issue of facilities. Where do you think this new wave of AI interacting with the life sciences is going to mean as executives in companies like yourselves are thinking about locating facilities? What are the drivers there to maximize the potential? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to start. So In Citro is about 260 people today, and we are, as I said, based right down the street in South San Francisco. From the very, very early days of the company, we recognized what you're framing very, very clearly, that there needed to be this new way of working. We have the opportunity. We're not starting as a big company that's trying to change itself from the inside. We're actually starting from the absolute ground, and we're building. And so from the very, very beginning, we kept an even balance between computational colleagues and experimental colleagues in the lab. And then over time, we added, general and administrative individuals like myself and my teams. But if you kind of look at the growth of the company as a bar chart over time, with different colors to represent the compute teams, which are data science, machine learning, software engineering, and the experimental colleagues in the lab, so cell biologists, molecular biologists, chemists, drug discovery scientists, there's a really nice balance between the two. And I think that's been critical to the success that we have had in terms of building a platform and driving towards our mantra of pipeline through platform. The innovations that have come at Citro have come from convening teams with these disparate perspectives, always represented from the very, very beginning. And what we have found is that those teams are not only able to better answer questions by working together, but they ask completely different questions, and they challenge preconceptions from the very beginning. One great example of that was we had cell biologists in the early days of the company saying, well, it's going to take a really long time to differentiate these cells, and we're going to have to come in the middle of the night. And when they achieve this level of confluence, sorry, it's an overly technical term, but we're going to need to do a step to split the cells from one sort of part of a plate into two. And the machine learning engineers said, well, you don't really. We can build an algorithm to do that for you. We can automate that step, right? Nobody would think that. And somebody else said, oh gosh, if only I could continue generating information on what's happening in this cell, but I have to stop the experiment and I have to stain the cell to sort of see in different colors all the things I want to see. And again, the machine learning engineers said, no, you don't. What if we actually really shined bright light on it and tracked it over time and used the machine learning model based on all the other cells that we've stained to use machine learning to introduce sort of faux staining? And that way you could generate that data over time. And the cell biologists said, really? And in fact, yes. And there are lots and lots of these examples that arise from just building differently. And I think to answer the question about what kinds of colleagues are we going to need more of in the future, it's going to be these individuals who are really excited to learn the other side and to reach across the aisle and take on that different perspective.
Speak both languages.
To speak both languages, this sort of notion of bilingual, I think, has really taken root in a nice way across our community. But I think more than that, I think it's flexibility of mind and curiosity and just interest in sort of continuing to learn and challenge the status quo. Because again, we're on this exponential and it's just going to go higher and higher and higher. And you just need to be able to think differently about what's possible.
Anyone else want to take that on?
Yeah, I'll definitely take the operations question, which is a simple answer for me, but I like what Mary said. I'll take a slightly more one step further. Universities and countries, they're going to have to invest in this sort of literacy in this area. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but honestly, we can talk AI all we want. But if we are serious about bringing this life sciences and changing the industry, you will be held to the lowest common denominator. And it's going to take that one person that doesn't subscribe to it, the regulatory bodies or the quality assurance folks, et cetera. And then you've got mass frustration happening because you've got all these people who understand this and the promise, but we're still doing things the same old way because that's the overall ecosystem. This requires a complete, the word here that was interesting was how is it transforming it? Well, it's not going to transform it until every part of the value chain speaks the same language and gets there. So I like your introduction where you said at universities, we're looking at how this sort of permeates across the entire system. I loved your point. Curiosity, leadership, executive presence, they'll always transcend the technology of the generation, right? I mean, but there is this element about literacy. And at Gilead, we're 19,000 people. Part of my job is to find sites, and I hopefully no one quotes me on this, but we don't make site decisions anymore based on incentives or tax benefits. That's part of the equation. Our biggest factor in deciding where to place our operations, where to place our manufacturing, where to invest is talent, period. That is it. I mean, access to talent which is why we spend an extraordinary amount of time looking at the university circle in those hubs, looking at the diversity, looking at in America, looking at the state and seeing what they stand for in terms of workforce of the future. So, and as I talk to economic development boards in various countries, very often the conversations are around, what kind of incubation capabilities do you have? What kind of data science capabilities do you have? What do you have in terms of the next generation workforce? And that is driving site selection, investments, large investments that we make, and which is why I think my encouragement is to people here who are in positions of power where they can influence the trajectory of where this goes, is to make considerable investments in how this ecosystem flourishes. Much in line with what you just said about, I think, the balance that you're achieving right now.
Mary or Vipul?
Katie,
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo everything that's already been said. I don't want to waste too much time if we have additional questions, but I think it really is this intersection, this literacy of being able to be, it's not that we need everyone to be a machine learning expert or a machine learning engineer. We need people to have deep knowledge and deep expertise in their area and an awareness and appreciation for what machine learning is, what's hype, what's actual, what the structure of a machine learning problem looks like, what the data needs are, so that they can bring that to bear in their everyday work and be part of the transformation. I hope we get to a point where machine learning engineering or the machine learning engineers aren't the majority of what we need, because it's that distributed, it's that democratized across a large company like GSK.
Any comment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are seeing this in medicine now. AI is part of the curriculum in several universities where medicine is being taught to young doctors. And I'll just share two examples. I mean, personally speaking, I've been with individuals. There was this one good lady who told me, who asked me, how does this AI impact me? And her simple question was, well, my brother was undiagnosed with lupus for 3 years. Now, using AI as a means, her brother could be diagnosed after all this while. Of course, this was a big thing. And there are several such stories from patients that I have. And now when you tell them, well, with the help of AI, you can, on your phone or on your device, have the ability to ask questions based on information and data that, based on your own health record, and get some insight into what might be happening with you without you having to wait for a physician, or without you having to every time go on Google and trying to make sense of all the search results that come up on it. That's a big impact. So essentially what I'm trying to get to is a point that was being made by Joydeep. It's contextualization, right? It's how technology, the use of technology and the application of technology is making it real for people on the street, and also for clinicians. I mean, we did a project last year where we were looking at lung, breast, and prostate cancer patients. And we were applying AI to actually find undiagnosed patients. Believe it or not, we did not find any undiagnosed patients in the data set, but we did find patients who were diagnosed properly, but were not being brought in for screening, in spite of all the data being there. And when we looked into it, thanks to the use of this AI technology, we were actually able to determine that these patients were being biased against because of demographics and social indicators, which is a very unfortunate thing. But for the first time ever, we had empirical evidence to talk about implicit bias. And this was quite big. Now, the FDA formally recognizes this in the US and actually has a term for them called, negative descriptors. And clinicians are being coached on this, to stray away from using these negative descriptors in patient records and be conscious of this implicit bias, which other would have been difficult. So I think it impacts on resource management, but also upskilling of resources and also informing existing resources, because remember, you're dealing with people of all ages. So some people...
No, sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying you're dealing with people with all ages. So, of course, the younger lot are a lot more in tune, whereas there are a lot more people who are already doing a lot of whatever they do daily in their professional lives. And therefore, contextualizing it and making it useful for them is very important.
I would like to spend a little more time on this issue of potential inherent bias that's in some of these algorithms and the concept of fairness and justice. And while it's very evident how important that is in the clinical space, I suspect it translates all the way down into the fundamental science space. So anyone want to add to that? Because I know the public sees it legitimately as a major concern about this new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as Mary's example earlier when she was talking about machine learning models identifying the scanner artifact, I think that's like an example of how machine learning and AI will find artifacts if they are there. It will find bias if it's in the data. We need to be thinking about fairness and ethics and responsible AI across the entire life cycle, all the way back to the very beginning of data generation and model development. It can't be a post hoc thing that we sort of tack on, we've developed this model, it's performing really well. Now let's look at how it performs across a distribution of different use cases, different populations. It has to be built in to the very fabric of the ways of working, the best practices, data generation, model iteration, testing, evaluation, and deployment. That's the approach we've taken at GSK. And it does come at a cost. It's extra work to think about these things up front, but it's absolutely critical for us to be operating in a responsible and fair way and to get to that endpoint where we need to be.
And in doing so, you ironically will get to a better space, because when we've had questions around bias, it's got chemometricians, data scientists, empiricists together to really be super thoughtful, right? And we were like, okay, let's get to what this means and those are questions around bias we should have been having 50 years ago, right? Because how clinical trials were designed. Vibhor talks about how there's a reason why so many of our trials don't have diverse representation, right? Is because we've taken a very formulaic approach that works for us in terms of speed. And there's some great potential here. Not just in terms of what Katie just talked about, but what Vibhor talked about in terms of getting greater access to medications, because that entire undiagnosed space, it's not a market. It's actually just incredibly good for patients, to be able to get access to that.
Great. I'm getting close to the last couple of my questions and want the audience to be thinking about questions that you have for the panel, but I'll keep on the theme of economics just because we're at APEC, we're not at a scientific discovery. Actually feels we're on a Disney cruise here, about to come into port. But how will some of the efficiencies be translated into value? What's the ROI on this huge investment in compute power and very tightly curated data sets? This is really expensive work to do well. So how is society going to reap the ROI on that? And particularly if we think, the downstream customer, for us at least, is a patient. How is that value going to get translated into the patient versus just make everything more expensive?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with that because we did spend a little bit of time talking about the downstream cost and the criticality of driving greater efficiency throughout the manufacturing process once you in fact have a drug that you know works and you want to deliver it to patients in the best way that you can. We talked a little bit about the criticality of diagnosing patients. I think taking a few steps backwards, unfortunately, the vast majority of drugs that we put through research and development fail. And you can debate the numbers, but it's something around 95% of drugs that really start on that initial track end up failing. And even as you look at later stage clinical trials, registrational phase 3 clinical trials, you have 70, around, depending on the therapeutic area, modality, et cetera, you have somewhere between 60 and 70% of those drugs failing in later stage trials. Most of them are not failing because of toxicity. Most of them are failing because they're failing to differentiate from chalk. So why is that happening? It's happening because you're not prosecuting the right target in the right patient population. And in the vast majority of cases, it's happening because you actually haven't understood the fundamental underlying biology of disease. Lots and lots of diseases are these sort of broad brushstroke, characterizations. NASH, Alzheimer's disease, ALS, lupus, which was mentioned earlier. There's a constellation of factors that you're using to find the patients, and then you found them and you still, Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, another just absolutely devastating example where In-Citra actually has an amazing collaboration with Bristol Myers Squibb or BMS, another large pharma company in that area where we're looking to redefine that disease. 90% of patients who are afflicted by that disease in particular have what's called sporadic ALS. It's a fancy word. It's also called idiopathic ALS, another fancy word. What does that mean? It means we have no idea what's causing it. And it's used in contrast to the 10% of patients who have, quote, familial ALS, where we have some idea of the genetic underpinnings. Unfortunately, in neither case do we actually understand the underlying biology well enough to target it. So the goal of a lot of these technologies and systems and the vast progress we've made on data and algorithms and compute, I think the goal is to get to a point where we can understand the underlying biology of disease and as an industry move to a place where we are able to deliver medicines to the patients who will benefit the most, starting by picking the target and moving all the way through to making the drug and picking the patient and running out that right trial. What that should do over time is significantly reduce costs because you're hopefully moving far away from those 60 to 70% failure rates in later stage trials. You're actually potentially shrinking those trials because you're selecting patients on the basis of biomarkers that represent the responder population, and you're potentially even running out the trials for a shorter period of time because you have a much more nuanced machine learning enabled way to actually look at whether or not the drug is working. So a whole slew of things to ultimately lead to higher success rates and greater, shorter timelines to get to more effective therapies that actually work at the end of the day in more patients.
So a technology that will really bring the vision of precision medicine to play. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as Katie said as well, I mean, we're really at the early stages of this, but looking at where we are and sitting on the inside of these companies, I think a lot of us can say that it's possible and that future is starting to come into sight.
Anyone else?
You asked a very good question, and I don't have a good answer. I don't know which part of the value chain will have to make disproportionate investments and who will benefit, because we have a fragmented healthcare system right now, and I don't want anyone leaving here, at least from Gilead's perspective, thinking that this in 15 years is going to magically make drug pricing much easier or reduce the cost, so it's going to need 2x cure or there. I agree with the points made around greater access, better research productivity. I like Vivor's points a lot about trying to ensure that clinicians and doctors are spending more time with the patients and not so much time. I go to a doctor's appointment, it's a 1 hour appointment, I see the doctor at minute 47. And then the doctor leaves in minute 49 and then starts entering a case sheet, right? And those are things that will change over time, right? If we go there. But it's a profound question right now, and much like the ethics and the data regulation and the governance, we need to be talk about the economics of this entire movement, right? Where it benefits, who benefits, and how does eventually the healthcare system benefit, right? in terms of being a far more efficient sort of thing. And I didn't mean to cop out here right now, because I actually think it's a discussion we're not having yet right now, because there is excitement, there is energy, there is enthusiasm about this, and we don't want to dampen that. Today, another company bought another AI company. Biopharma companies have gone away from buying companies for molecules to companies for expertise now in this space. So it's clearly something that people see value in, but who captures the value? I think it's debatable right now.
And how does this become more than just a developed world thing, and the value gets pushed into the developing world? The term that I was introduced to by a colleague at UCSF was this concept of democratizing privilege. And Vipul, you kind of touched on it, where if I get a cancer, I can call my friend at Dana-Farber or our own cancer center and get world-class care. But AI has the potential of giving access to that kind of care from all parts of the world. So I think that's a very exciting issue. So my last question to the panel is, what are the limitations, the most important limitation you think of the current generation of AI models that are limiting the full potential, and what next advance, which I'm sure someone's working on and will be released 2 hours after we walk out of this panel, speed things are happening, but what advance in AI would be most helpful in each of your companies?
I can share a few examples, if I may.
Thank you.
I was actually at a hospital federation meeting in Lisbon last month, where we were talking about some of this. And I had 2 questions from the audience. One was from Africa, a physician who said, well, you guys in London and South San Francisco are doing all this cool stuff. We don't have the money to do it, to your point, Chancellor Hawgood. How can we get on board and is there an opportunity for us? Because we do want to treat our patients and improve the standards of care, and to your point, provide equitable access to care. So, and the latest access to care and healthcare developments. And yes, they have skipped a beat in the sense that they are not plagued with traditional systems and infrastructure. A lot of what they're doing is that they are capturing a lot of data through mobile phones and things like that. And they want to access technology, but how can they do that, and how can they do that in an economically viable manner is a real question. The second question that I had in the audience was from India, and that was along the same lines. I mean, there are women in villages and tier 3, tier 2 cities in India, who might have a lump in the breast, not being fully aware that they should be brought in for a breast cancer screen. And the primary health facilities in those parts of the country might not be, or perhaps are not as good as what we are being told to be able to bring these patients in. So technology can really reach those parts of the world and really help both the patients and also the care providers who might not be fully trained physicians. These are good questions. I know from what I hear, there are lots of efforts going around in that regard. It'll be splendid to see how all of this plays out, especially, as you rightly said, in the non-developed world.
Any other thoughts?
I'll give a very simple answer, because I think the other 2 speakers may have more sophisticated answers on this, given the thing. But for me, it's standards. Right now at Gilead, the joke is it's not artificial intelligence, it's augmented intelligence. We use it as an add-on. But our basic way of working is still quote-unquote old school, right? Let's use it as an additional piece of intelligence to sort of, as a reference to and validate this right now. But till it gets and permeates, goes back to literacy, goes back to vernacular, goes back to making it more ubiquitous. And I wonder whether somebody joked in my company, let's stop calling AI, maybe that's going to get them to believe this, because there's this black box nature. And a lot of people have sort of said, oh, this is just hype right now, and there's a defensiveness there. Yeah. So I've given a very mundane answer here right now, but because it's been so overwhelming in such a short period of time, there is natural skepticism within parts of the larger companies. It's probably easier for smaller companies that subscribe to this. It's tougher for large companies to all get on board at the same time and And I think the way to overcome the cynicism is standards. Build standards around it, get it more ubiquitous, get the next generation of talent to have the literacy, have a common vernacular, and go from there.
So it's more about actually building the human intelligence in this space than the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, we've struggled in convincing that this is not black box, right? There is no alchemy to this. It's actually more scientific, and the underlying models. But because we haven't attracted data scientists, 150 is your size of the group right now. GSK is how many? 100,000? Yeah, so you can do the ratio, right? And that's the ratio right now. So until that changes a little bit right now, I don't think we'll see the full scale of the transformative promise that this is.
I got the 5-minute signal a minute ago. So if anyone wants to add 30 seconds to that, and then we'll take questions. Let's go to questions. In the front here. There is a microphone, and we'll try and be real short on the answers if we can.
Hello, panel. It's very informative. I don't come from a medical background. I studied economics. My question to the panel is, you alluded to that, the access to data and the sharing of that data to make it more, to have a more efficient modeling for the medical profession to diagnose. What are the impediments in that? The access to data and the sharing of data? Aside from the licensing issue and the sharing information between the research institutes and the medical institutions, and you're running corporations that are mining data and making it more efficient in the algorithm that you use, but coordinating all that, what are the impediments that you have in the access and the sharing of necessary information?
Anyone want to tackle that? I mean, Mary, you said you made a deliberate choice when you set up the company that you were going to generate all your own data. You weren't going to get it from the outside. And I think you explained why, because it has to be of sufficient quality. But are there examples where there is sharing going on?
So first of all, I think it's worth breaking, your question has a lot of different components, but maybe I'll just kind of at the highest taxonomy from a machine learning perspective, split it data and say that there is language data and there is non-language data. So from a medical record standpoint, if you think about an individual patient, there's all of the objectively measured information about that patient. Let's say it's an oncology patient, there is that person's age, there is the date when they got diagnosed, there's the histopathology, there's may or may not be genetic sequencing or RNA, which is protein expression levels, but there's sort of this objectively measured data, and then there's a whole slew of additional information, which is the physician notes. And then there's a whole lot of additional information that's available in the world, which is also based on language. A lot of the transformations that are happening from the machine learning standpoint, as it relates to the delivery of care and the physician experience, has to do today with language and large language models, be it MedPalm from Google or various other overlays and fine tuning on BARD or GPT-4 or what have you. A lot of work happening on top of large language models that are actually very widely available. I mean, anyone can go and set up an account on your OpenAI or access BARD via Google, et cetera. I have no bias on that. Use your favorite large language models. There's a lot happening there. If you're talking about access to high content, objective phenotypic data for patients, there are a large and growing number of sources. The UK Biobank, I think, a pioneer in the space, but many other sources coming online as well, where those types of data are becoming available. Genomics England, who NCITRO works with very, very closely, has a large research environment that makes a lot of those data available to pharmaceutical research partners, I think including GSK, I think perhaps also including Gilead. And the development of novel technologies on those types of data is what's happening now. So I think they're just on very, very different timelines, and the tools that are being made available to practicing physicians in various kinds of environments, I think, are going to be also on very, very different timelines, meaning the imaging-based will lag significantly.
Last question, okay, with your hand up over there.
Hi, thank you all for such an insightful panel. I wanted to talk a little bit about the statement that you made regarding, people and planet over profit and how that's such a tension. You can see it in the protests, it's all over the news, and I was surprised to hear that sentiment echoed in this room as well. And you can see that there's a disconnect, and I wanted we've been touching on those concepts a little bit, but with that frustration, especially regarding affordability and accessibility, I wanted to hear your insight on what is that strategy looking like? How do we communicate that so that we can ease those frustrations when people are struggling right now? Thank you.
It's a big question, but
Huge question. Yeah, we want to go, people?
I didn't want to talk over you, but I do have an example to share. Go ahead, Joydeep.
We will have a far more elegant example on the patient side of stuff because it's important. But a lot of companies are using not just these technologies, but actually finding ways to make drugs accessible more widely. As an example, Gilead, we gave our patents for free to Indian CMOs to actually make it. I don't want to make this a drug pricing issue because we can get into this, why is the US the medicine chest for the world, all that stuff. That's a bigger conversation. The comment I made about this is I really believe one of the reasons we've been prioritizing profit is the sustainability of the company, is that's the only way we fund research, right? Is we actually get there. And I feel that this has the potential to draw down the entire inefficiency within the ecosystem, where you may be able to give back more. That was my intent right now, because research is very expensive. 95% failure rates, give or take a few percent. But to keep that innovation engine running, you've got to generate the profits to feed the innovation engine to affect humanity. And then what happens is when your drug gets successful, what do? We build plants. And then the vicious cycle continues. The plants generate emissions and we cause more diseases. So I think the way to break the cycle is to actually get to a more efficient way of operating. And this is where I see the potential of this, right? Where things don't cost so much. So researchers can say, the pharmacoeconomic model around this drug is okay. Because Joydeep, we're not going to spend billions bringing it to life. That was my comment right now.
Vipul, I'll give you the last comment, and then we'll close.
Thank you, Chancellor Hawgood. I was just going to build on what Joydeep said, because this is very true, and it's a real point of importance for everybody in the clinic and in the ecosystem. So, I was once asked, why aren't pharmaceutical companies working on a drug for head and neck cancer? As a very broad statement, and I know some are already, but head and neck cancer is very common in the Southeast Asian region because of tobacco chewing and the smoking and prevalence of other sort of social habits. But the common argument that was made was, well, that there's not much of a higher paying capacity in those countries, and therefore not a lot of R&D happens. But actually, if you look deeper into it, from a clinical standpoint, it is not because of that reason. It's more because the data was not available to do the R&D in the first instance, because you didn't have many patients around that in the Western world where a lot of the R&D was happening. Now, when you do that, when you bring those facts to the fore and you educate your clinical persons and your researchers in those countries, and you tell them, look, this is the kind of data that I think Mary picked up on, Mary said, earlier, that this is the kind of data that you actually need to do the R&D, and therefore let's start capturing it at source, start educating the people who are capturing that information and educating them about the importance of that information and how it's going to help drive R&D. That has a really, a sustainable sort of a positive feedback loop. And we have seen that happen now, not just in head and neck cancer, in lupus, in CKD, chronic kidney disease, where, almost 90% of the patients are undiagnosed. We're seeing that in these countries, regarding the question where affordability is not as high, but actually by educating the practitioners, you're able to capture much richer data, which is then having a positive impact where pharmaceutical companies and research groups are actually investing locally to look at that data and come up with new methods to treat those patients. And guess what? Because it's happening locally, then dare I say, and I've seen only some examples of this or indications, that the drug prices are a lot more affordable and access to that is a lot more affordable. And hence I was talking about the sustainable feedback loop. In terms of access to latest and the greatest technology at an affordable manner, we went through a journey with smartphones and something that Chancellor Hawgood, you talked about telephones and other technologies. I'm sure it's bound to come to AI. where it will be commoditized and it will be made available very sooner rather than later.
Great. Well, on behalf of the panel, let me thank you, the audience, for your attention and interest in this subject, and please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion and for them spending some time with you all.
Thank you, everybody. That was an incredible panel. Our next session is going to be at 2:15 p.m., which will be on the food and agricultural breakthroughs. We want to thank Biocom California and Michelle Nemetz for the incredible work putting these panels together.